Will you pray for me? Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. He was asleep, but he was starting to make those little sounds like he was going to wake up soon, and she knew that this was her moment. So she went and she got big fluffy towels and she laid them out flat on the counter, and she got that little towel, the one with the hood and the ears that her sister had given her at the shower. And she got the big blue plastic tub, and it would barely fit in the kitchen sink, but she put it in there and she turned it on, and she realized that she had filled it up like it was for herself, and it was way too hot. I'm such an amateur, she thought to herself. So she dumped half the water out and she put some cold in, and she tested it and tested it again and tested it again until she was pretty sure that even her own mother wouldn't criticize the temperature of that water. And she got the shampoo and she put it there, and she got the lotion and she put it right next to it. And it was all laid out and perfect. And by then, his little sounds had turned into louder sounds, and he was awake. And so she picked him up. She set him down next to the bath, and she undid his clothes so carefully she could not believe how many snaps were on every piece of clothing that kid owned. But she got them all off eventually, and she got the diaper off, crossing her fingers all the while. And she laid him in the bath. And she bent over him, and she looked so deeply into his eyes, and he looked up at her, and she was sure he smiled. Her mother would say it was gas. She knew it, but she did not believe in that. That baby smiled at her, and she said, "Oh, my child." She reached in, and she got that first handful of water, and she poured it over his head, being so careful to be sure it didn't run in his eyes, and she said, "Oh, my child." And she looked at those tiny little fingernails and those tiny little toenails, and she could hardly believe how perfect they were. And they were way too long, and she knew it, but she couldn't bring herself to cut them. She was so nervous about cutting him. So she looked at those long fingernails and those long toenails, and she picked up each little hand and rubbed it gently and said, "Oh, my child." And she laughed at those great big rolls of fat on his thighs. She couldn't believe how fat that boy's legs were, and she ran her finger in each of the creases to be sure they were clean. And as she did, she said, "Oh, my child." And she tried not to think about this, but she couldn't help it. She tried not to think about the day when he would one day, that great, big, beautiful boy there, he would be even bigger and more beautiful. She tried not to think about the day he would go into the bathroom and say, "Mom, I can do it myself." And shut the door in her face, and then take a strangely long time in there until all the hot water was gone and his sister was banging on the door. She tried not to think about that. She tried not to think as she held her child there in that water, as she caressed every bit of his body, as she washed him so gently. She tried not to think about the day she would have to open the front door and let him walk through it. She tried not to worry about what he might face out there on the street, what they might do to him, or what they might say to him, what he might do to others, what he might become addicted to, or afraid of, or hurt by. She felt so powerless when she thought about that day. And so she did the only thing she could do then, which was to say, "Oh, my child." She tried not to think about whether this would be enough, about whether what she was doing right then would be enough to see him through, but it was all she had. And so she said, "Oh, my child." And she took him out of the bath and she laid him down in a towel and she wrapped him up quick before he could get cold and pulled that hood over his head. And she didn't know if he would ever remember what she had done just then. And all she could do is hope that it would stay with him somewhere deep inside and he would not forget it down deep in the places that mattered. And she didn't know if he would or not, but it was all she had. And so she picked him up and put him on her shoulder, all wrapped up. And she said, "Oh, my child." Amen.